African Utility Week studio. I'm Nicolette Pomper-van-Zyl, editor of ESI Africa. Today I am speaking with Henning Wuester, who is the director of the Knowledge and Policy and Finance Center at IRENA. Welcome, Henning.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
Thank you for joining us. I want to start with some information around policy and how we can improve policy to increase the uptake of renewable energy in Africa.
The good news is it's getting much easier. As prices of renewable energy technologies are coming down,
Yes.
the burden on policy to provide a lot of support for renewables is much lower. Now, there are some ground rules which need to be respected, and I think African countries can still improve a lot on those. It all starts with very clear target setting. Some countries have done that very well and very convincingly, and that brings me already to the second point. Being convincing about targets means that you have political leadership, you have a policy framework that is clear and transparent and actually matches up with the targets. So those are some of the key requirements that need to be put in place and can be easily put in place. Then the next level is to make sure that you talk to all the market players so that they understand policies. And one critical aspect is also that you build capacity in the country, that you have the skills in the country to actually live up to the ambition that you have set out with the target. So renewables has the great advantage that you can create local jobs, but if you don't have the skill set to fill those jobs, then you might be losing out. So that, I think, is an additional requirement which is often forgotten. So the main thing is long-term thinking and long-term planning.
Right. I like that you mentioned all the market players that you need to be speaking to them. So this brings me to the question around private-public partnerships and how we can develop them more in the renewable energy sector.
The sector, especially in Africa, can be very much driven by private investments. That's where the scope of renewable energy investment lies, and that's how we can get to scale. I mean, it's the private sector that has the money, that has the resources to make this a success. But it will need the public partnership in order to get going, and that's where good government support comes in. That also includes some very practical aspects like permitting schemes that are simple and not overly complicated, some taxation schemes that are favorable to renewables. And then when we look at public finance institutions, I think there's a whole range of issues that these institutions can do to stimulate the private sector to come in and to have this partnership.
But a little bit earlier we were talking and you mentioned Indonesia as basically a region that is really coming up at the moment in terms of renewable energy. What are they doing that is really sparking your interest?
Well, I mentioned it in the context of wave energy. So this is, I mean, we often look only at solar and wind as renewable energy technologies, but there are more technologies out there, and marine energy is a very interesting one for the future. And wave energy technology is still not really a commercial proposition, but Indonesia is investing in it in a large manner, which makes sense if you are a country that basically consists out of many islands. And that, I think, is a very ambitious and very encouraging signal. But Indonesia is also working a lot on solar and wind and a lot on biomass, which I think is also an important ingredient into the mix of renewables. I think they have understood that renewables is favorable to them. to their development, and they are following that up by putting in place this kind of credible policy framework that allows investors to come in.
So Indonesia is definitely a region to be watching, and here in Africa we hear a lot about Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania that are ranking top in terms of renewable energy development and deployment. What is it that they are doing that is putting them and pushing them to develop renewable energy so quickly?
It's very much along the lines that I explained at the outset. I mean, they have put in place targets, to some extent very ambitious targets, and they have followed through already a couple of years ago with policy frameworks, mainly feed-in tariffs initially, and that has started the market, and the market is now growing. You are seeing an increasing track record, which is of course something that's interesting to investors. If they see success, they are happy to come in and to be part of that success story. So that has happened. Kenya is very interesting in looking at wind. They are, I think, leading in Africa in terms of wind energy deployment. They also have gone into geothermal, which is of course very interesting there for the Rift Valley and applies to many countries in that region, and is a very stable source of energy. In that sense, perfect as an additional complementary energy source to some of the more variable renewables. So those are some of the aspects. Kenya has also been very good in putting in place thermal heat standards. So they require new buildings to have solar thermal for water heating, which saves a lot of electricity and brings in renewables in a different manner. So that broad coverage combined with good policy is really making the difference. Of course, Uganda is a good example of setting an ambitious target. I think they are aiming for over 60% of renewables by 2025, and they are well underway to reaching
very achievable.
Half of that already. So it's quite ambitious. And then with the Get Fit program, they have the policy framework, and now all these countries are also following up with renewable energy auctions. And that's interesting as renewables become cost effective and can compete without subsidies with other conventional energy sources. That allows countries to really bring the price down and be very beneficial for the consumers in getting electricity for a very low price. So I think you mentioned these three countries. You could also add Zambia, who has been very successful with a renewable energy auction recently, getting a record price for solar PV for the African continent. Rwanda moving very actively into this now, also putting a lot of emphasis on rural electrification. I think one element to highlight for Africa is the off-grid sector, with either standalone systems for households in the rural areas or mini-grid solutions for villages, which is a very quick way of getting power to those that would otherwise wait years and years before the national grid arrives in their villages or in their rural neighborhoods.
But we are coming along in terms of development, but the issue around finance always remains. So
Yes.
My last question is around what innovative finance mechanisms are out there that project developers need to know about.
I think if we take a step further, the point I made about public finance institutions focusing on mobilizing private investors then the focus should be much more on risk mitigation instruments than has been so far. There is a tendency that public finance institutions go for direct financing, whether it's loans or grants, and that is not the most effective way of increasing the market share and increasing the market size. So we would encourage them to go much more for risk mitigation, provide guarantees, help with early stage project development where the risks are highest. Geothermal is an example where you have specifically high risks in the exploration phase.
Exactly.
Public finance can come in with insurance schemes, and that was one of the success stories in Kenya. So these kinds of guarantee schemes should be much more prominent in Africa, and if you have those and you show that they function, they work, then private investors will come, and private investors are watching the market very much. So there are a lot of local project developers that are very well placed to advance in these markets, but there are also international developers that come with a lot of money behind them that are eager to get into the African market and fund some of these renewable energy investments.
Local commercial banks, are they also?
Very much so. I mean, I had a very good conversation here with a local South African bank that's actually active all over southern Africa and very much focused on renewable energy. They are eager. They see that this is an interesting investment proposition. They want to go into these. We will need to overcome some hurdles because in some cases, especially when you talk about off-grid renewables, but also if you talk smaller utility scale, the investment size is too small for some of the big investors and even some of the big commercial banks that have resources. So there we will need to work with project developers that they can bundle projects. We can aggregate several projects into a bigger portfolio that then can be financed by commercial banks or by institutional investors.
Henning, thank you so much for sharing that insight with us and for joining us here at the African Utility Week studio.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Look forward to future engagement.
Definitely next year.
Or perhaps you can come to Abu Dhabi to the World Future Energy Summit.
That would be marvelous.
Let's pursue that. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I'm Nicolette Pomba-Van Zyl, editor of ESI Africa, coming to you from the African Utility Week studio.